Hey, I'm Shay Warner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today we are visiting with Cathy Tokash about finding ways to share the beef industry story in face-to-face settings, and how advocacy and the format and the message has changed in the past 30 years. Cathy is a wealth of knowledge and experience in this topic, so this is really a great episode for anyone who maybe feels the urge to do a little more advocacy, whether that's only once a year or multiple times a year, but maybe you're not really a fan of social media or you just love that face-to-face interaction. Cathy has some great ideas and stories to share. So, let's visit with Cathy. Does tax season make you want to bang your head against the wall? Is billing a bad word in your household? Does meeting with your ag lender make your blood pressure rise? Stress a little less with cattle management software, Performance Beef. It tracks important feed, financial, and health data all in one system. The results? You can pull inventories, detailed financials, and invoices in minutes. Get ahead for next year's tax season. Visit performancelivestockanalytics.com to learn more. Well, Cathy, good morning, and thank you for joining me on the show today. I know you have a very busy spring schedule like most ranchers, so I'm glad we were able to make it work amidst calving, and both our families have production sales, and everyone's got a lot going on, so thank you for joining me this morning.
Well, thank you, Shay, for inviting me. I've always been one that when things are important, I will make the time, make the arrangements to be available.
Absolutely, and you are definitely a very involved person within the industry, and that's kind of what we're going to talk a little bit about today. But before we dive into that, the leadoff question that is kind of a hard hitter, but every guest gets to answer right away is, why do you believe in the beef industry?
There's multiple reasons why. Number one, it's my livelihood. It's what I do in my day-to-day living. It's not my job. It's my day-to-day life. It's important to me to share the message of what we do with the cattle, how we work with them, how we get through the seasons, the good seasons, the tough seasons. It's something that we do, so that's why I feel it's important to believe in the beef industry. Another issue is today's consumers. Many of them are, 1, 2, 3 generations removed from what we do, from where their food comes from. And I believe in the importance of beef as their protein of choice. So I need to feel like it's important to visit with the consumers regarding, what we do, why we do, how we get that great nutritious food to them. Because we all know beef is a powerhouse of nutrition. You can get so much from 3 to 4 ounces, and guess what? It's plain beef. You don't have to put it with sauces or creams or anything like that. It's one of those one-item delicious protein. And, the beef industry is important actually to our land, our environment. There's a lot of land out there that's not tillable, and we utilize cattle to turn that grass into something that's delicious and nutritious. So beef industry is important to our land and our environment. And the other thing that the beef industry is, when you think about economics behind it, look what each cattle ranch in your area does to support the community, the economics. We have the feed stores, we need feed supplies, we need veterinary supplies, we need vets, we need truck drivers. We also are important to a lot of different people that need to make their living also off of the beef industry.
That's a lot. I think you hit it all there, Cathy, and I appreciate you saying that, and I can very much tell, and mostly because I know you, but especially just even with that response, that you have done and continue to do a lot to share the story of the beef industry and even the story of your family's ranch, because you yourself have a very rich background in the beef industry, growing up on a ranch and continuing to carry that legacy on.
I've been fortunate. Yes, I grew up on a ranch and went off, did my nursing degree, spent my years as a registered nurse, but I also was always still involved back with the cattle and with the ranch, because that was just something as a nurse I was lucky was able to do. I could, switch my schedules around so I could help work with the cattle. So they have truly been important pretty much my lifelong years.
So, what we're really going to talk about today is kind of your story as an advocate. And a lot of people today are advocating on social media, finding those online platforms. For me, it's, the podcast, but you have really done a lot of in-person advocacy and you show up face to face. So can you share some of the ways that you show up and create those face-to-face interactions with kids, consumers, and people not directly tied to the beef industry?
When I was able to start becoming more active within beef industry, the route that I did take was with the cattle women. And I guess I was very fortunate. I had a mentor. Well, I had a couple mentors, but Kay Nelson was the one that steered me into the importance of education with our students, the importance of education in the classroom. So she kind of is the one that 10, 15 years ago got me started with the education in the classroom. I mean, she would line up teachers or teachers that she knew, she would have me contact them. So I was very fortunate to have a mentor to allow me to do that. And once you start getting into the classrooms, you really see the questions that those kids have. And it was really interesting, the variety of questions over the years. And me being a registered nurse, I dealt a lot one-on-one with patients and families. Going into the classroom now had me in a group setting. So there was a little learning curve there, but I felt it was so important based on the reaction of the kids, the students, and the teachers. So then I, did the classroom K through second grade, where you take our books into the classrooms and you read them and then you talk about them. And you explain kind of the story, like what do I do compared to this book? So I make real life so they understand that it's not just in a book, but this is what I do. Last year when I was in the second grade classroom, I took one of Amanda Gradke's books, C is for Care. And it kind of talks about all the things we do caring for cattle and the work that we do. It talks about, in the winter storm, what we do. And that also happened to be the classroom my grandson was in, one of my grandsons. And it was kind of interesting at the end of reading this book, comparing what myself and my grandson do, during certain seasons. A couple of the kids commented they had no idea how hard a rancher works or how hard their classmate works sometimes. Like in the storms, they're playing in the snow. He's out over here helping shovel the snow. So it was a real great opportunity for those students to understand, what we do in the day-to-day life. In situations where I've been in the middle school, it was kind of explaining the career of what a rancher does. And there again, it's kind of interesting, some of the questions. I kind of had a presentation where it showed the different seasons of what we do. Again, the students didn't realize, the things that we do for our cattle when the weather is not the greatest. And then also, when it comes working with students and adults at different events, one example is when we go to the military appreciation at the North Dakota State Fair. I really enjoy that event. It's a lunch that we sponsored for the military in North Dakota, and families come through. And there's, kids from all ages, from the babies in the strollers to the teenage adults, and even the college students are there. And there's some really great conversations I've had. One that really sticks out in my mind is a discussion with the dad and his two teenage sons who were both in different type of sports. And, I said, what do you guys use for your protein recovery after these long games or these runs, if you're a runner? And they all said, well, we like to have beef. We do have some chicken, and then, we do some of these protein shakes. And I said, well, what's your first choice? And of course, the sons say, well, we'd love it if Dad would buy us steaks every day. But they understood the importance that, when you're an athlete, you need an appropriate protein for that recovery. And at that young age, it was great to see that these, young men were realizing that the right protein is important. So we had some great discussion with that. So there's so many things that you gain when you can do that one-to-one or that group presentation. The discussion that comes out, the questions that they're asked leads to another question. And I think that shows our true sincere how we care for our animals, how we care for the environment, when we are able to have that face-to-face discussion, leading from question to question. And I like to hear their stories. I ask them, what is their experiences? Have you been on a ranch? Have you been on a farm? And of course, when you ask that to a first and kindergarten class or a first grade class, all the kids' hands come up and they have to tell you the story about the one time they went to grandpa's or to aunt's. But, that's important because they feel like they have a connection to what a cow is. I mean, everything is a cow, and that's okay. That's their understanding, and so you can have great discussions there. So that's why, for me, it's important to do the one-to-one. And, sometimes there is some of the social media that goes with it. When we deliver our books, the North Dakota Cattle Women have a strong program where we get these beef accurate books out into the school libraries and city libraries. And we do like to share that on social media. A couple of reasons is, number one, so people know those books are there and available. And then also just to, acknowledge, those that have helped us fund these books, to get these books out to the areas where we get them into the libraries. So social media does play a piece there, but my choice, I guess, is that one-to-one.
You've done a lot of that over the years. Now, we will continue to talk about that, but I don't want to brush over what you said, where you said when you had your career as a nurse, that you were one-on-one with patients there, and then going to a group setting was a little different. So maybe share a story or talk a little bit about how, even though you weren't as involved with cattle women when you were focusing on your nursing career, you were still advocating for beef in that hospital setting.
I do have a couple of good stories. Well, I guess one's a pretty good story. The first story is I had one of the nurse colleagues. I mean, her and I communicated a lot as far as, when she knew I was a rancher, we talk about beef and talk about recipes. And then we kind of got to the point where after a weekend off, we see each other at the beginning of the week. She goes, "Oh, Cathy, guess what we grilled this weekend?" Or, "Guess what I tried?" And I said, "Well, great, it was delicious, right? And it was good." And she'd say, "Yeah." And then, next weekend she goes, "Well, Cathy, we had chicken this past weekend." And I said, that's okay. You can vary your diet, but you realize the importance of beef in your diet. So it was kind of like, we see each other and we check on, beef recipes or whatever. But probably one of my better stories is a physician colleague. Got to know him, and actually he was from the Bronx in New York. And he shared with me when he found out I was a rancher and whatever, and he probably heard me talking about beef with somebody else. But anyway, he shared that he was a vegan, a practicing true vegan while he was in medical school. And I said, "Oh, really?" And I said, "Well, are you still today?" Because I wasn't exactly sure where this was going. And he says, "No." He goes, "I learned back then that type of diet was not healthy for myself, for him." He said, "I realized that I needed to make some changes. If, number one, I was going to make it through med school. I mean, we all know that takes a lot of energy." And so he realized that he needed to switch over to a different protein. And he did choose the beef protein. And so he was a very firm believer in the value of the nutrition of protein in a diet and how it impacts you, your daily life, your workload, your energy level, your ability to even think, and study. So then as we got to know each other better, I'd be walking down the halls, and if it was quiet, we maintained professionalism, but he'd say, "Here comes the beef," or "Where's the beef?" or "There's the beef lady." And, and occasionally if someone was walking with me, they'd kind of look at me like, "What's he saying?" And I says, "It's okay." I said, "I'm kind of proud to be, known as the beef person or whatever, because it's important to share why beef is important." And, hearing his story was really a great one. And so we had a "Where's the beef?" conversation a lot.
Were you able to have quite a few conversations about beef with patients too in past time? I mean...
Actually, I would have liked to have more, but unfortunately, we did have the dietitians that did bring the diets in. But another story is after one of the younger dietitian, really early in his career, I could tell, had brought in this menu and this list of foods, that the patient should be eating. And it was an older gentleman or whatever, and actually a rancher. And I'm listening to him. I did happen to have enough time to kind of see what he went through. And it kind of, told him how he needs to limit his red meat. And my little rancher says, well, I eat beef. And he says, well, you really need to look at chicken and fish and all these type of things. And I thought, okay, and because that was his part of his job, was to give them the prescribed diet. But when we left and walked out in the hall together with a dietitian, I did mention to him, I says, there is new science out there, the importance of beef in cardiac patients and that type of thing. I said, I realize there's set protocols. I said, but, I'd really encourage you, to look into that new science of beef, just to see if it make a difference. Again, there's protocols that are followed and are established. But, he appreciated our conversation, and it was one of those eye-openers that, we really do need to work with that dietitian industry as far as when it comes to teaching the appropriate protein, because the beef industry has spent so many dollars on finding out the nutrition facts that are scientific facts. They're not just hearsay from what was 35 years ago. So it's important to, share that there is new research out there.
Support your cattle's health and productivity with Vigortone minerals. Since 1912, Vigortone has been a trusted name in animal nutrition. The revitalized product line offers targeted nutrition for every stage of production and every region. Vigortone delivers consistent performance and simplifies your mineral decisions. Wherever you are, Vigortone works. Visit Vigortone.com to learn more, and that link is also in the show notes.
Well, I appreciate you sharing those stories, because I think it's just a great reminder for people that advocating beef can be as simple as talking about what you do, sharing what you know, and just sharing where to find other resources and experts, even if you are not the expert. I mean, I think every time I fly, I kind of enjoy it when I'm sitting by someone I don't know, because here I was on my way to California for a conference with my husband in January, and I got to chatting with another gal for like the last 30 minutes of our flight, and she was just very interested and enthralled by it. And, she had just been on her boyfriend's grandpa's place, and she had all these questions about it and was very seriously interested. And it was a great conversation.
And I agree, sometimes we can do more in those conversations, spending time, like you said, sitting in the seat, standing in line. A lot can be gained from that. And the one thing that I've also learned, I don't have to be the advocate that knows everything. I can be the advocate that says, here's where you can get this scientific information. Here's where you can get more information. And I think for me, once I realized that I didn't have to have the answer for every question, but I could tell them where to look for it. And I guess I do have a side story with that. I know one of our events that we were at, one of our Ag Day, and again, school children, and we were discussing beef byproducts and, explaining all the things that are beef byproducts, how 99% of that animal is utilized in some way or another. And plastics came up as one of how is plastics? Well, I wasn't at the booth at that time, but I had left. And then when I came back, one of the cattle women, was kind of anxious. She goes, well, they asked me this question, I didn't know how to answer it. And she goes, but I did Google it. So she did Google and found the answer. And so that helped me understand, or made me aware of the fact that when we discuss some of these things, have some of this printed material available for the other cattle women, so that when somebody asks the question, we can say, well, just a minute, we've got this over here. Let me get this for you and, explain to you how or why that's a beef byproduct. And I think that increased the comfort level of all the cattle women doing those events then, because like I said, we can't be a walking encyclopedia for everything, but having that understanding and offering where they can find the information is important.
Absolutely. Now, with those events, you already kind of touched on that you're doing a lot with kids in school and trying to connect with families. Can you share a little bit more about why you yourself and Cattle Women's really does try to target that elementary aged student?
The thing is, that those students are eager for knowledge. They're eager to learn, eager to understand. Again, like I mentioned, they like to share their stories. But the thing is, if we can giving a positive impression, a positive image. Meet the rancher. This is a real person early on in their life. Hopefully that continues through, and cattle are always positive image in their mind when they're driving from over to see grandpa and grandma in 100 miles away, and they drive by the fields and they see these round circles out there. Well, what are those hay bales? Well, what do we do with those hay bales? Well, we feed them to the cattle in the winter when the snow is deep. You start telling some of those stories, then they think positively of what cattle are, what ranchers do, and hopefully that leads them to realizing beef is an important protein in their diet. As they're older students, we can start introducing that, and then they will pick protein as their choice when they're out there buying their food in their college dorms. It's probably going to be ground beef, but that's okay. And then when they start their young families, they'll remember that, yeah, this is good for me. Ranchers are great people out there taking care of our environment, taking care of the cattle. So it's a positive image. I think before I started in this 20-some years ago, there wasn't always that positive image. And I think we've learned that if we start this positive image sooner in the adult's life, whether it's, kindergarten, first grade, that will carry through their adulthood, and beef will be definitely their choice of protein.
And I think it's important that we don't underestimate the power of having these conversations even in rural communities, because like you said, when you talk to your grandson's class, there were a lot of kids who had no idea, even though, they had someone in their class who was involved in a ranch.
And then that brings on another, 10 years ago, probably at one of our Egg Day events, we have a giant cloth hamburger that we kind of talk to the kids about, what's on each level, and talk about the hamburger, the importance of the hamburger. And one of the questions we ask them is, well, where does your hamburger come from? Well, it comes from McDonald's, which is okay, I guess that's right. Or, it comes from turkeys. And we go, okay, so you understand that family uses turkey burger. So it's, and this was Mandan, North Dakota. I mean, Mandan, you would think, is quite rural. And especially that year, for some reason, a lot of us cattle women commented to each other how some of their questions kind of surprised us, thinking that Mandan was this rural, and these schools that kids were coming from both Mandan, Bismarck, and the surrounding area. But yet, we have many out there that don't have that ranch experience or generations back where there actually was family on the ranch. So you do need to do it in your small towns, in your rural areas. It'd be great if we get to the big cities where we really need it, but we try to get into the Bismarck schools too, which we consider a bigger city, but it is important at all aspects.
Calling all ranchers. If you are looking for a better way to optimize your grazing operation and rev up your bottom line, Noble Research Institute can help. Noble's team of ranch managers and researchers work together to find solutions to your challenges. They don't just give you answers, they can help you understand how to apply their research-tested and field-proven principles on your ranch. Visit noble.org to learn more and browse Noble's educational resources. Do you know any of the numbers or statistics on hand for last year, how many schools or kids that North Dakota Cattle Women's touched?
I don't have, and I will say that unfortunately we are getting better at our record keeping as far as, what is our number of students. We are working also on the mileage, how many miles do we put on. And actually, the district that I'm in, we're probably the one that is really strong in going into the classrooms from across the state, which is, each district kind of has something special that they do, but I would say our district is one that goes into the schools the most. And I kind of just pulled some numbers here quick together, and last year actually in classrooms we probably hit over 400 students that way, and the number of classrooms, what was that? It must have been about 15 or so classrooms. And the one thing that we started with is we're working on the mileage and the hours of our volunteerism. And so for those, 400 students, we spent about 28 hours between four of us, our time, but we put on about 1,100 miles just to meet those students. So, we were close to 1,000 last year, just kind of rough estimates that were actually classroom or like a classroom activity where they brought in big groups to an area, which I know doesn't seem much, But it's a start, and like I said, this year, hopefully our record keeping will be a little better to see our number of actual students.
So I'm curious, how has the advocacy message changed, if at all, from when you kind of first started on this journey to where you're at today?
That is a really good question. And I guess actually, probably 30 some years ago, I was kind of invited to help with some cattle women events, if and when I was available as I was raising our babies and working and that type of thing off the ranch. And I would, try to help when I could. And at that point, you handed a sample and you handed a recipe card. And that seemed like that's what you did, for all the hours. And it was like, okay, and that's what worked 30 years ago. But as I got more involved here, 10 to 15 years ago, and even I guess from the beginning of my 15 years ago, we've learned that you no longer just send out information. You try to share information. You try to bring up a conversation regarding the information because you want them to ask the question, not me tell you this is how it is. It works better if they ask you the question and then you can discuss it. And again, let them tell their story or why they're asking the question. And discussion seems to be so much more effective than just handing out a piece of paper or, we still, hand out a beef stick or we hand out samples or whatever. But it seems to be much more effective when you have a conversation with the consumer and the student versus just saying this is how it is in black and white. Conversation is much more effective.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Cathy, do you have any final tips to share with ranchers who want to get involved with face-to-face advocacy events but aren't quite sure how to get involved?
One of the biggest challenges with advocacy is time. We all have a 24-hour day. We all have our jobs to do, our work to do that needs to get done. We have chores to do. It's calving. We stay up at night, so we're tired during the day. But the thing is, in order to continue that positive image, we sometimes have to stop and say, okay, where can I give a half hour here? Where can I give an hour here? We just need to start taking little baby steps because it is important to our beef industry, to our livelihood, is that we get that message out there. How do we start, especially when there's cattle women interested? I just can't help you with all those things. And I'll say, you know what? If you can do one event a year, do one project, I said, that's great. Once you start with one project, if you can work that in your schedule, we've got things that go on, throughout the year, which is the time of year that you can help. And then they'll say, oh, okay, it's not like you have to join and do 52 things. It's only one thing this year. And then you'll say, oh, wow, that was kind of fun. I like that. What can I do this time of year? What's going on? And then they'll slowly, add one or two things. Because I'll be honest with you, sometimes for some people, once you start doing that, you really get excited. When you see the reaction of the students, when you see the reaction of the consumer, when you work some of those booths, some of them are really a lot of fun. They really are, because conversation is great. But yeah, there is that extra work of, the setup, the tear down and all that type of thing. But I try to personally, keep that to a minimum to our new ones. I just want to get them involved because it's important, that we all do something coming from everybody. And like I said, any small little thing that you can do does make a big difference. Whether it's with the cattle women or you may be interested in the policy side of what exists in the beef industry. Get involved there. Because without some of that appropriate policy within the beef industry is going to also suffer. So we can't do the promotion, we can't do the education because it's not going to be there as viable as it could be without the correct policy. So if you're somebody that would rather work on policy, there's one example would be work with the North Dakota Stockmen's Association. There you can get your policy piece in. If you like the education, great, come help us with the cattle women and do that. Or simply when you're sitting on the plane and having that conversation with who's sitting next to you. It doesn't have to be structured, but just, start somewhere, start telling the importance of beef, what we do for our cattle, what we do for the environment, how important it is in your diet. So you can start small And I hope someday you'll come and say, can I join the Cattle Women so I can help you with that? Or can I join the Stockmen's Association? I really am interested in this policy. So start with just, whatever you can give time for. And I hope, your time will build from there.
Absolutely. Well, folks, first of all, Cathy, thank you for joining me for this conversation today. I always appreciate visiting with you and hearing your story. And for anyone out there listening, get involved with a cattle organization that aligns with your beliefs and start promoting beef, because at the end of the day, we all want people to consume our product because we put a lot of hard work, time, and effort into it, and we know it's doing great things for those who consume it and the environment. So if you want more show resources for any ads or anything that was mentioned throughout the show, please head to the show notes. And remember, the best way to support podcasts is to rate, review, and share with a friend. But with that, happy ranching, folks.